Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today in person and online. I'm Nancy Murr with Ollie at Berkeley, and it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dorothy Lazard. Dorothy is the author of this you can see this, deeply observant and moving coming of age story, What You Don't Know Will Make a Whole New World, depicting her childhood from St. Louis to San Francisco, through Oakland. Dorothy was a librarian in the Oakland Public Library System for
20 years, 21 years, something like
and
that.
the head librarian. Okay. And the head librarian, you can imagine what I was saying, people online, and the head librarian of the Oakland History Center for prior to your retirement for about 12 years. So Dorothy, a little bit of housekeeping. Dorothy's going to speak a little, read a little, and take your questions. And if you are online, pop them into the chat or raise your hand. I think that'll work, and we can unmute you. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dorothy Lazard.
Thank you, Nancy. Good morning, everybody. I'm usually, did I knock something over? No. I'm going to say, can everybody silence their phones?
Good reminder.
Yeah. So I've silenced mine and put it away. So let's begin. Well, I want to thank Nancy for welcoming me to the Goucher Lifelong Learning Institute. I've heard a lot about it. I've seen your programs, and I'm glad to be a part of it. So thank you very much for the invitation. And what I want to do today, as Nancy said, is to read a little, talk a little, offer up some questions. If anybody has questions about how to put together a memoir, and also if you want to share memoirs that you have loved, I will definitely do that during this talk. So please come on in. We got some more people coming in. And so let's start. Who made you who you are? What historic events made you who you are? What drew your character? What carved your personality? Who were your influential people? So those were some of the questions that I was asking myself in 2017, 2018. I was approaching my 50th anniversary as a Californian, and I said, I should do something. And I didn't want to just have like a party, 4 hours, you get a little tipsy, you have a lot of good food, your friends come over, and then it's over. And I felt like 50 years deserved more of a commemoration than that. And so I started writing down these things that I felt like were worth salvaging. I'm of an age where I'm starting to forget a lot of things. Names, places, the order of life events. And I also have some people in my family who are suffering from dementia, and they've lost a lot of their, history. And so I was inspired to start writing down things. And I didn't have any sense when I started that it was going to be a memoir and it would be published and sold on Amazon and bookstores near you. I just wanted to write some things down. Now, people have the impression that because the book came out shortly after I retired, that I had started writing it after I retired. But parts of this book are results of homework assignments that I did during an MFA program I did back in the late 90s. Some of it's from journals, some of it's, brand new writing. So it was just kind of like a mix of things and just things that I never sent out and let anybody see. Just memories, essays that had been published, parts of essays. So it's a real amalgam of different writing that I'd done. I wish I could write fast enough to make that be true, that I wrote it after I retired and it got published a year later. But I'm not that kind of writer at all. And as I was writing it, I wanted to, like I said, secure those memories of the key things that made me who I am. You know, you get into your 60s and you're just like, who am I? Why am I not taking guff off these people anymore? You know, what happened, you know? And so I want to read you a little bit from the beginning of the book, and then I'll jump around deeper into the book and let you know some context. So yeah, 2018 was my 50th anniversary in California, and this is how I came to be in California. I'm going to start where the book starts, the road west, 1968. My family arrived in California the winter after the Summer of Love. Ours was not the journey of eager anticipation of the 19th century gold miners who rushed to the Sierra, or of the anxious desperation of the Dust Bowl refugees who came before us. We were reluctant migrants, but all children are. And the three of us in the backseat of that white Pontiac were indeed children: my mother, my big brother Albert, and me. My grandmother Ella Baskin had come to claim us. We were the part of her family who had been living precariously, but sometimes contentedly in St. Louis, away from her and the rest of my mother's clan. This, our first cross-country trip, marked the end of our independence as a nuclear family. The journey along Route 66 was the end and the beginning of everything we had known and would know. As we traveled long and desolate stretches of highway, with my mother's younger brother Shelby driving, I tried to imagine what California would be like. The nuns at St. Vincent's had told me about the Golden Gate Bridge, which in my 8.5-year-old imagination, I thought would be truly golden. We were headed to San Francisco, to my grandmother's house, where we would live. For how long, the nuns at St. Vincent's didn't say. Uncle Shelby, or Shirley as my grandmother called him, was jovial and gregarious. He told us about all the cousins we didn't know we had and the aunts and another uncle we would soon meet. He was an enthusiastic hugger, which I wasn't used to but liked just the same. He was solicitous to my mother, and like her, smoked cigarettes like they were going out of style. So I figured they must be related. In that car, I began to see my mother with fresh eyes. Medea was not just my mother, our mother, my father's wife. She was part of something larger, more complex than our nuclear family. Her name was Laverne, but this uncle called her Sis, which gave me the first hints of her having a role other than mother and wife. She had a family she had been born into, a mother from whose body she sprang, a father who had already lived and died by the time our journey began. Still, I never felt in those first few days that with our grandmother, that Medea and her mother were close. They didn't talk much during our journey. I couldn't imagine them taking long walks together, or playing marbles or Chinese checkers, or scrubbing each other's backs during bath time, like Medea and I did. No harsh words were exchanged between them, but I sensed they were strangers, not on the same team. There was an unspoken tension. I couldn't remember my mother ever having talked to us about her mother. When our grandmother appeared at St. Vincent's Day home to retrieve us, she could have been the president of Jamaica for all I knew. I had never heard a story about her or seen a picture of her. It wasn't until my brother pushed me toward the Pontiac and I saw our mother in the back seat that I began to think my grandmother could be telling the nuns the truth. And besides, they wouldn't just release us to anybody, would they? After a few days of visiting with our father, who had moved in with our oldest half-sister Mary, we left St. Louis and traveled west along Route 66 and hummed the classic Nat King Cole tune to bide the time. We survived both the curses of racists in Amarillo who chased us off the sidewalks and the hellish heat of the Southwest desert. That journey west was the longest time I had ever spent in a car. We didn't break our cross-country trek with a sleepover anywhere, just kept driving and riding and driving after water breaks and pee breaks and food where we could get it. When we made our first stop in Needles, California, just over the state line. Needles, I thought. What a funny name for a place. Were there needles on the ground? Is this where needles were made? Did a lot of seamstresses live there? I didn't know what to expect from the Golden State. It was beautiful in completely alien ways. It was early March and there was no snow on the ground. It wasn't even cold. The landscape was flat as a pancake and vast, dotted with desert scrub. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, we'd see mountains in the distance, so big and majestic they looked like something out of a cowboy movie, decidedly not urban, which was the only environment I knew. The red brick buildings of St. Louis were nowhere to be found. It was during this journey that I first considered the sky as a separate and beautiful thing distinct from the earth, not just the incidental wallpaper to some cityscape. Out west, you could see so much of everything all at once. I sensed California could be something quite literally marvelous. It was wide open spaces, orchards, ranches, and rolling hills covered in wildflowers like I'd never seen. I'm going to stop there and drink some tea. Thank you for the tea. The 2 or 3 days we spent in the car felt like weeks, but finally in the second week of March, 1968, we arrived in San Francisco at the white 2-story duplex at 1139 Cole Street that my grandmother called home. My Uncle Melvin, who lived downstairs with his wife Beverly and son Melvin Jr., greeted us warmly. He was also gregarious, a big guy, taller than Uncle Shirley, with a booming voice and a smile that shone from his mahogany face. The whole Baskin clan, it seemed, was upstairs to meet us. There were cousins by the dozens. I didn't try to remember all their names as each filed in front of us. There were little cousins my age and younger, and teenage cousins Albert's age and slightly older. Say hi, they were told, as they trickled in that first night. These are your cousins from St. Louis. I looked around the room, shy with all their eyes on me, and still suspicious of this mother-daughter connection. For one thing, I noticed my mother didn't look like her mother or her siblings. She was honey-colored, while the rest of the family was a hearty chocolate brown. They were beautiful in their sameness, but different from the woman who was supposed to be my link to them. Medea was slender, angular, and what I thought at the time, tall. My grandmother, Mamela, everyone called her, was short and wide-hipped with very high cheekbones, false teeth, and a large mole on her nose that kept her glasses from sliding down her face. I stuck close to my mother, looking to her for some sign of how to interact with these new people, and also because I had missed her so much after being apart from her for more than a year. My cousin stared at us, and I nervously stared back. I didn't know how to be around cousins. The only cousins I had known were my mother's cousins in St. Louis, all grown men with whom I had only a passing acquaintance. Would these California cousins be protectors, tormentors, friends? So I'm going to read a little bit from a section that everybody wants me to read from. So I'll read a couple of bits from the chapter Western Edition, which is my introduction to libraries. And I just want to, I'll read a little bit and then we can start talking about memoir and books and anything else you want to talk about. The Western Addition Branch Library this is a few years forward from that first part. The Western Addition branch on Geary Boulevard in Scott was where I discovered a world I hadn't imagined before. With each book I read, my perceptions ballooned. In my house, there were only two things to read besides the San Francisco Examiner and my grandmother's Bible and old copies of Jet magazine, a miniature tabloid filled cover to cover with celebrity gossip, society weddings, and political news. The Bible seemed too forbidding with all of its tiny print and odd names. And Jet never held my attention past the TV listings of upcoming shows featuring Black performers. But like so many other grandmothers in the neighborhood, mine swore by both publications. At the library that year, I read the autobiography of Malcolm X and learned that during his incarceration, Malcolm had copied a page from the dictionary every day. He was what people called an autodidact, a self-taught person, and I wanted to become one too. The library was a great seductive classroom, fueling in me tactile and cerebral longings. Hungrily, I read snatches of every book I touched. I read reviews on the back covers of paperbacks, first paragraphs, last sentences. I was fascinated by the variety of cover designs, type styles, chapter headings, and titles. It seemed to me that I could live forever reading every day, all day, and still not read everything in that branch library. The concept was overwhelming, troubling, and tantalizing. Each time I learned a new word or noticed how a writer cobbled sentences together, what diction she used, I felt like fireworks were going off in my head. British writers, I noticed, spelled words differently from American writers. Parlor with a U, apologize with an S instead of a Z. They loved adverbs and used them to great effect. There were a thousand species of plant life and landscapes I didn't know. Yew trees, moors, sycamores, heather. I discovered that many of the movies I loved had begun life as books, and I bounced my way through many of them. The children's books came in so many shapes and sizes, they created a mess on the shelves. One of my favorites was Ticonderoga Tales, a book so tall and narrow that it had to be tipped on its sides to fit on the shelf, and still it was a trip hazard. Always a daydreamer, I was supplied with fresh fodder at the library. I could spend the afternoon becoming an inventor, a prairie farmer, a slave, a runaway slave. I read The Thin Man and fancied myself a detective. The Diary of a Young Girl about Anne Frank hiding with her family in an attic to escape Nazi torture made me rethink all those World War II movies I had watched that focused on the soldiers, never the kids. I learned a bit about the French Revolution from Alexandre Dumas and the power and variety of poetry from Langston Hughes. I discovered Freedom Train, Dorothy Sterling's biography of Harriet Tubman, which sparked a lifelong obsession with the famed abolitionist and with runaways in general. Most significantly, I found Black women writers, Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison, and Virginia Hamilton, who spoke about things in a language I recognized. I'll never forget the feeling of exhilaration that came over me when I read Black dialect for the first time. It was like being in a room with family members, seeing words in print that had only existed for me in spoken language was validating. Seeing them in books somehow made what I had experienced feel significant. And I realized that Black girls could grow up to become writers of books housed in libraries. What a powerful thing. Whoever knew? So I'm going to stop there and talk a little bit about putting this together and figuring out, once you decide that that it's turned into a memoir, because at some point it did feel very bookish. It's pretty substantial. It's not just, disparate essays. Now it's demanding some kind of narrative planning. And so at some point, I have to just give up the ghost and say, this is now going to be a book. And you have to, pledge to yourself and make a commitment to yourself that you will carry this out. And so, and also you have to think about it as your life story as becomes a commodity. Once you decide it's going to be a book, and then you have to market it, and then you have to convince somebody to publish it and so forth. It can have an emotional impact on your writing, on your voice, once you have entered into some kind of arrangement to make it a book. But even before we get to that, just I wanted to talk a little bit about craft, if people are interested in that. How many people here are interested, or on Zoom are interested in writing their own life stories? Or I just want to talk a little bit about craft and some of the decisions that have to be made in order to do it. So I'm getting a lot of thumbs up in the room, and hopefully in the chat, people are responding. Please add your questions in the chat if you are online. First of all, I want to do some terminology definition. A memoir for me is just a snapshot of one's life. It's not striving to be an autobiography to tell everything. A memoir is just striving to tell like a little slice of your life. It might be a work memoir about, this is what it was like when I worked in the coal mines, or this is what it was like when I was a teacher, my first few years as a teacher. It might be about a particular relationship with someone. It might be, so there's limitations. It might be a limitation of time. It might be you're limited by, well, I shouldn't say limited, but you're focusing on either a period of time like I am here, or you're focusing on a type of relationship, or just anything that just gives you a sliver of some emotional growth that you've had, the experiences that led to that emotional growth. So whereas an autobiography is trying to be everything, tell everything, include everybody. And for me, I'm not as a reader, I'm not as drawn to that genre at all. I don't want to know everything about everybody. I don't know about you, but I'm just not that interested. And then when you decide, okay, I'm going to write a memoir, and it's going to be about my life in the library, or my life in the Marines, or if you decided this is what it's going to be. And then you have to decide who's going to tell your story. And what do you mean by that? I'm sure some of you are asking, well, I'm going to tell my story. But what I mean by that is, will it be you, the adult, or will it be you, the kid? For me, with this project, I had to decide this would be a very different book if the 60-year-old Dorothy told a story about this childhood. Whereas if I told the story from a child's perspective, it's going to be a different read, a different feel, different language that you're obliged to use. Because I as an 8, 9, 10-year-old, 15-year-old, I wouldn't have known all the things that I know now about my childhood. And I also had to make the decision that I didn't want to, for lack of a better word, corrupt that feeling of being a child, that enthusiasm, that unknowingness of childhood. We don't know everything when we're kids. We don't know everything now. But so those are decisions that you have to make as well. Who are you writing to is another decision you have to address. Who is your audience? Is your audience, when I first started writing this, I'm going to take my coat off. Oh, I can't. Wait a minute. No, we're going to stick it right here. For those of you who are not in the room, nothing dirty is happening. So who are you writing to? Who is your audience? Who is not the audience that's going to buy the book, but when you're just at home in your room working on, chapter after chapter, who were you writing this book for? Who did you want to read it? And when I was in the process of writing this book, the people that I wanted to read it were a very select group of people. When I was writing it initially, it was kind of just for my family. My niece and nephews who don't know these older relatives, who many of whom have passed away. But then later, that group of people who I wanted to read and benefit from reading this book were, teenage girls, uh, Black kids in general, bookish kids, and it started to, mushroom who I wanted to, and then also just people who live locally, who grew up locally. When I met Nancy, we talked about our Bay Area childhood and what it was like and what we liked about it and how things have changed over these many years. And so, writing anything is very an organic process. And so, you may set out with some kind of idea of what this thing is going to be that you've imagined. I will create this thing. But like every organic thing, it is influenced by the environment, the time you spend creating it, the time you spend composing it. And you have to kind of go with the flow and find out what it will be. I mean, there is still craft to be deployed, and managing that organic thing that wants to be its own thing. And what I mean by that is there are times when I wanted to put other scenes in, other information in, but it's like, is that really serving the narrative? Is that really creating the flow and helping facilitate that arc that I am imagining? There are a lot of things that happen to us in our lives, but not everything needs to be told, you know? How many people have read the book already? I don't want any spoiler alerts. So it'll make me decide, it'll help me decide what to tell and what not to tell here. I don't want to ruin it for people. But there are decisions you have to make all along. What story to tell? This one over that one, this friend over that friend. In my book, there are two teachers that well after the book was written, I was like, dang, I forgot to even talk about them, because I had completely forgotten. And I see this book as kind of like a recovery mission. I'm trying to create something to recover memories that I feel like I'm losing, and I'm doing it for my younger relatives. I'm doing it for people who don't know me, to kind of salvage that time in my life that I feel is really important, that I feel really made me who I am. And it was a very fraught time in our nation's history, the late 60s, early 70s. So who's watching the time? Anybody? So I'm going to read you something that I was very obsessed with libraries and books once I found libraries. And I just want to read you as quickly as I can a very important part of the book. So by the time I'm 10, We've moved from the Haight-Ashbury, and we've moved to the Western Addition, which is now Lower Pacific Heights. Stop it. But we lived on Pine Street in the Western Addition in a big Victorian house. And when I was 10, a lot happened in the world. We were in Vietnam and the moon landing, and and I do want us to talk about place as a character marker, a character builder. So this is me and my relationship with the libraries. This new appetite of mine reached a fever pitch when my older sister Sarah came to California from Chicago to attend nursing school. 10 years my senior, Sarah was my mother's third child from her first marriage, the child my father reared after our mother's first marriage dissolved. Like the gold rush pioneers we had learned about in fourth grade, Sarah had heard California was a land of opportunity, a great place to get a good education and make a new life. Convinced by our grandmother that school was cheap in California, Sarah arrived in San Francisco full of hope, radical ideas, Smokey Robinson and the Miracle albums. Her hair was an explosion of Black power, a big Afro style that made me feel a little less self-conscious about my own lost hair. She owned a copy of Mao's Little Red Book and loudly condemned the Vietnam War. She was a radical in our midst, like the ones we saw on TV. Sarah blew a breath of youthful, unpredictable vigor into our quiet Victorian. Unlike my mother, my grandmother needed no medication to soothe what ailed her. She needed order. Order didn't come. When Sarah found out I liked to read but had no library card, she made sure I got one. To my relief, the librarian didn't ask any questions when Sarah nonchalantly signed the library application. The librarian simply typed out our cards and handed them over to us with a smile. I felt like a real citizen then, with my first city-administered membership card. Sarah had very particular taste in books. Mysteries, romances, histories, poetry, and Gothic tales by Edgar Allan Poe were her favorites. She was the first avid reader I knew. She introduced me to Shakespeare's sonnets, the Nancy Drew series, Paul Laurence Dunbar's poetry, which she could recite by heart, and Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice, which I crawled through, confused and slightly horrified to find curse words in print. With Sarah as my first reader's advisory, I was suddenly in book heaven. I wanted to become her literary comrade in the house, someone with whom I not only read books, but discussed them. Sarah tried to explain to me alien concepts like colonialism, Pan-Africanism, and the conjugation of French verbs. Once she began school, she brought home history books and anatomy textbooks. As my view of the world expanded, so did my view of myself and my place in it. My notion of education was forever altered that year, and as a result, so was school's relevance. My household obligations took on a growing insignificance. After reading Louise Fitzhugh's children's novel, Harriet the Spy, I took to roaming my neighborhood, pretending to be a detective like the main character. In a small steno pad, I jotted descriptions of how people spoke, ate, held their cigarettes, how fog rolled in from the west, how the elderly lugged themselves and their parcels around. It was fun to watch life in all of its varied details go on around me. I felt my senses developing, like muscles being toned. One day, while I was playing with Peppy, this is my dog, in the backyard, enjoying a swath of rare afternoon sun, my grandmother called me in. "Hey, come in here." I saw the top of her head as she leaned over the banister. "You hear me. I know you're down there." When I reached her on the sun porch, I saw she was holding my rumpled notebook. "What's this?" she asked. Her smirk let me know that she was in no mood for half-baked answers or sullen silence. "That's my notebook." I said more defensively than I intended. What is this you're writing in here? About me and folks at my church. She flipped through the pages. See, here's my name. Ella puts on her white usher board uniform and white shoes and heads to church every Sunday at the same time. I couldn't figure out why she was so angry. I hadn't misrepresented her. What was so bad about me noticing her? She went on, pointing out names of familiar people and places. Why are you taking this down? Even though I had pretended to be a spy, I figured my grandmother must know, how could she think otherwise, that these were only harmless notes. Descriptive phrases that became sentences, seeds to stories I would write for my backyard audience of one. Surely, I thought, she couldn't believe I was a real spy. I was just writing, I said. They're just notes. But for what? Why did you put my name on this paper? I shrugged. That was enough to set her off. She reached for the fly swatter, the nearest weapon she could find, and popped me a few times on my bare legs. Tears came, but not from the pain inflicted by the fly swatter. I cried because once she put the fly swatter away, she peeled off page after page from my notebook and ripped each one into shreds. By destroying my first attempts at writing, though, my grandmother unwittingly lit a fire. Her act of intolerance was an important lesson about the power of words. There was something about what I had written that put her on the defensive, made her look at me differently, with a suspicion that at least promised engagement, if not acceptance. Words written were exhilarating but costly. People who were committed to them paid a price, I was learning. And that price, I would realize later, is where great stories come from. With these words set down so innocently, I was building a voice of my own, word by word, page by page. All learning is risk, for it is an admission that you don't know something and are willing to do whatever it takes to gain knowledge, no matter the cost to ego, relationships, or expectations. Words that had lain so passively on pages before my relationship with the library now took on new meaning. Every word meant something, and together they could create storms, tirades, worry, suspicion. They could also liberate and weave fresh possibilities. All children have interior secret lives where their imaginations blossom and their perceptions of their worlds form. I was no different. As a reader, I was learning so much about, but I somehow understood that not all of what I was learning should be shared. I knew, for instance, not to tell Mamela that I did not believe in what they preached at her church. Religion, God, and the precepts of the church, I sensed, were inviolable to her. Something not to be challenged, at least not out loud. And I'll stop there. Thank you. So let's do questions. Yes.
Do I need? Oh, yeah, you do. Yeah, you're such a pro.
Hi, thanks so much. Your memoir has a lot of humor in it. Are you just a funny person, or was that how did it's really fun to listen to it. It has
I
a
don't
lot
know
of
how to
humor.
say this in a way that makes me not sound crazy, but I am a funny person. Yeah, I'm a pretty funny person. You know?
Yeah.
But you know, I think a lot of life we need to laugh at because some of it's so ridiculous. We should all be really laughing right now, if you know what I'm saying.
Yes. Wonderful.
If it wasn't so terrifying.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Dorothy, I haven't ever really thought of writing a memoir, although I've written a couple of
Personal
short pieces that pertain to my personal life. But what I was daunted by when I wrote the short pieces is exactly what happened when your grandmother saw what you had written. So I was somewhat deterred, but not, because I eventually wrote the piece, about what people would think who were in my family about whom I wrote. So it seems to me that you were fortunate that your grandmother saw your writing when you were young, and you learned the lessons about what to write about your grandmother and what not to write and why. But as you started writing those pieces that became your memoir, did that come again to the forefront of your mind? Because in your memoir, you write about many, many people, some of whom have passed away, but some are still alive. So were you concerned about how to write about people who are in, pivotal in your life, but how they might react to it should they read your memoir upon its being published? I'm assuming you weren't giving copies around to everyone, but maybe
No.
you did.
Well, that's another decision that has to be made, isn't it? And then also you have to, have something written on your desk or in the top of mind. Who am I writing this for? Is it their story or my story? Since you've read it, you notice that in the memoir, I write when I don't know something. I don't remember that nun's name who took care of us in the orphanage. I don't remember certain things, and it's okay in a memoir to say. I mean, you really build readers' trust when you say, when you don't know something. As far as what the relatives would think, I didn't give that much thought because I knew that would hamstring me. There was only one episode depicted in the book that I felt I needed to talk to somebody about. Because this is a memoir, this is an exercise, and a bit of it, the decisions I made were a bit limiting because I am a big fan of Tobias Wolff, and in his fabulous memoir, This Boy's Life, which is still fabulous, he says at the very beginning, this is the story my memory has to tell. So I wasn't checking with people. I wasn't checking journals. I wasn't interviewing people. And this is just my memory. And everybody depicted in it will have a completely different story than the story I've told. But there was only one incident, and I won't say what that is, where I felt like I needed to talk to people about it, because it implicated somebody that they cared about. But then I ended up not doing that. I ended up not doing that because it was hard enough to write. The person is dead. A lot of people in this book are dead. But being that they're dead wasn't necessarily a freedom. I didn't see it necessarily as a freedom. It was just the situation, And, but that's tough, when you, and a lot of people do this, when you do ask people, well, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? Then it becomes less and less your story. It becomes their story. And if you're okay with that, that's okay. I knew I wasn't going to be okay with that. And I'm not really close to be honest with you, I'm not really close to a lot of my family in California anymore. We grew up in a very multi-generational, everybody goes to grandma's house for dinner, for holiday dinners and stuff like that. And, after she passed, that became less and less a thing. And then everybody kind of went off into their kind of like nuclear silos. And yeah, I won't give away
Thank you.
everything in the book, but.
There's a question in the chat about how do you edit? How do you edit your life to be included? You talked a little bit earlier about choosing not to talk about that and
Mhm.
choosing about some, what
Well,
was your,
being aware, I would say being aware of the narrative arc that you want to tell. You know, like some people are very frustrated with me because I end the book where I end the book, but that's what I intended. I just wanted just that part of my life to be depicted in the book. Uh, and what stories best serve that arc? What stories best depict the people you want to depict or the message you want to send? When I do writing workshops, we talk a lot about theme. And you don't have to go into writing a memoir saying, my theme is going to be patriotism, or my theme is going to be, you know, benevolence, or so, you know, but themes appear as you're writing. They appear to you, you know, once you string all those chapters together, and it's like, oh, you know, like in my book, the notion of reinvention and empowerment and estrangement, familial estrangement, kind of crops up. And then recognizing those themes as they appear helps you kind of build and serve the narrative arc. Um, you know, like there were a lot of significant deaths in the book, but one, and right in the middle of those significant deaths depicted in the book, my dog died. It's like, does anybody need that too on top of all of this? You know, and then, yeah, I decided not to put it in there. R.I.P. Peppy. You know, I decided not to put it in there because it just felt a bit too much, you know. But, you know, and I realized that well after I had finished the book, and it's like, oh, yeah. You know, because my neighbors are all after me about getting a dog because they have dogs, and then we could walk our dogs together. It's like, I'm not doing that when I can have a cat and be in my house. So, so no, I'm not getting a dog. And also it's traumatizing when your dog dies because, you know, your dog is like part of your family in a way that a cat is like, girl, please, you know. I love cats for that.
and there's another question in the chat about how do you get started? You had all these bits and pieces that at a certain point you realized were becoming a memoir.
Yeah. Oh, how do you get started? You just sit down somewhere and you just write a sentence and then write another one. This is my friend Gary, who is a journalist or was a journalist in England and a very well-known journalist. And he said his advice is just you sit down and then you write a sentence and then you write another sentence and then you write another sentence. It's like, do people pay you to tell them? But and it's true. You just write a scene, something that, you know, the first time you learned how to ice skate, or, you know, your first day of school, or your prom, or the fact that you didn't go to prom, something that still lives with you, that you care about, that mattered to you. And like I said earlier, it might be, you know, talking about your job or talking about your relationship with someone or what motherhood has done for you, whatever you want to write about. Just write something. Just write a scene. And then there's another scene that's connected to that scene. You know, because that's all we're doing, living, is playing out these little dramas all the time. You know? I think he has a question.
When you were going to be publishing this, did you work with somebody who went through everything and talked with you about what to include, what not to include, or how to rephrase it? Did you have an editor?
No, when I was well, I did have an editor, and still have an editor. Uh, um, my book was published by Heyday, which is a Berkeley-based publisher, a nonprofit, a very equitable, reputable publishing outfit. And I was assigned an editor, Emmerich Anklem. And But my book, even when I, you know, presented this work to Heyday, my book, I was like 130 pages into it. And so it kind of was what it was. And I was fortunate in that not a lot of it needed to be changed. We did have a, writer-editor relationship in that he, tidied up the language and asked questions if things were unclear to him, and I had opportunity to go back and clarify things. We had a few, I would say, generational and editorial conflicts, also some linguistic conflicts, because at some point the manuscript was also handed to another editor who I didn't know. And this is where, thank you for asking this question. This is where you have to stand up for what it is you want this thing to be. And at some point, it seems small now, but at some point, this newer editor wanted to change a word. And it was just one word because she didn't want me to use the same word in a paragraph. It was like canned meat or something like that. I was talking about spam or something in the book. And she suggested I use the word tinned. Well, I don't know a Black person anywhere outside of, the British Commonwealth who uses that word. And so I was like, this is, I didn't know that word as an 8-year-old. I wouldn't have used that word. And so like tinned meat. Americans don't use that word, and Black people certainly don't use that word. And it's like that, it was kind of like finding a bone in yogurt. It was like, nobody I know would use that word. So, even on that level, not the arc of the story, but even a word, if it's out of place, if you feel it's out of place, because it's your story, if your family wouldn't use that word, it's worth fighting for, I felt. So, yeah, there was that. Thanks for asking that.
Yeah, a craft question.
Mhm.
You had talked about how this is a compilation of a bunch of different writing over time, but then you had to make it in kind of one voice or from one age. Can you give an example where something was written, I don't know, 10, 20 years ago, and then you had to change it? Like, how did you change it into the kid's voice or something?
The Western Edition chapter started out as kind of like an essay that I wrote when I was in my MFA program at Goucher College. I had written that as just like a homework assignment where we were learning how to write personal essays. And I had written about the library, discovering the Western Edition branch library over in San Francisco. And so bits of that, the seed of what ended up being the chapter was that. And then there was also another piece in there about, I think when we moved to West Oakland, my sister and I moved to West Oakland. I don't remember exactly, but certainly the Western Edition thing. And it wasn't just like a copy and paste into, the memoir manuscript. It wasn't that. It was just kind of like a reimagining of what I wanted to say about that period of time. But the interesting thing about writing memoir or anything personal is that you're writing and you're trying to capture all of these memories, but then, months later, years later, you remember something else. Like writing was so important to me as a teenager, but why didn't I write about my journalism teacher? I wanted to be a journalist, and I couldn't remember anything about her when I was writing this. And at some point, you have to surrender the book, the manuscript, to the publisher, and that's all she wrote. And so there was a little bit of that. And So, no book is perfect and no person is perfect. So you give yourself grace and do what you can. If I could stop the Q&A for a second just to make some suggestions of if you are interested in doing memoir, one of the best how to do memoir books I've ever read was by the memoirist and teacher, creative writing teacher, Mary Karr, Karr, The Art of Memoir, which was a fascinating book. It was a little bit of literary criticism, but it was also this wonderful guide on how to write memoir, what makes a bad memoir, what makes a memoir fail, what makes a memoir work. And she has a list because she's been teaching creative writing for such a long time. And she was a student of Tobias Wolff, who I love. And so she has a list in the back of the book of all the great memoirs that she liked, like Speak Memory and I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. Some of my favorites are certainly I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, which I recently reread for my Angelou tribute program over at San Francisco Public. Memorial Drive by Natasha Thwethwy. I can never say her last name. She was a poet laureate of the United States a couple of times, so you'll be able to find her easily. Memorial Drive about her relationship with her mother and her mother's murder. Another one, The Beautiful Struggle by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and his more famous book, Between the World and Me, thank you. Also great. And then some slave narratives are really great. Of course, Frederick Douglass's, he's written a couple. And what was another one that was really, really good? Say again? I haven't read that. I can't speak to. No, I'm forgetting his name. But, I was just really impressed by, well, I'm forgetting his name, so it doesn't matter because I'm not going to remember I'm so bad at names and titles. How was I ever a librarian? So, but, they could be quite fun. Joe Brainerd, I remember. Joe Brainerd, every sentence is I remember. And after a few pages, it reads like an incantation where he's stringing a life along. It's a tiny little book. And, but it reads like poetry. I remember this, I remember this, I remember this, and to sustain that for a whole book, I think is really masterful, Brainerd, like brain and A-R-D. A-I-N-A-R-D. Yeah, Joe Brainerd, I remember. And I always pick it up whenever I see it in a bookstore, even though I have a copy at home. It's like you have a copy at home. Stop it. So, what else did I want to talk to you about? Voice, remember that. Who's going to tell your story? You, adult? You, middle-aged person? You, teenager? And then you have to be, have some integrity in the telling. And it's like, make sure that your diction is using the words you would know at that time period, right? And, my narrative decision to write it from a child's perspective also kind of limited me in that there were some things I didn't know, so I couldn't really tell. I know now, but I couldn't really say. And some vocabulary that I didn't know, that I know now, that I could have used. So those are decisions you make going in. Of course, you can change your mind and change the whole narrative tone of it. And then that's the other thing about tone. You were saying I was funny. And, some memoirs are like dirges. They're just sad all the way through. And some memoirs are, funny and peppy and, they just swing, and then there are so many types in between. Yes, ma'am. The arc of your story, ARC, Like, where does what journey are you taking the reader on? Mine starts with being in a car. It's like, it's about travel, it's about a journey, rediscovery.
That, how much education in terms of the technical part of writing a memoir should one have? There's some programs and certificates now available in memoir writing. I'm wondering, how much do I need to know about the technical parts of writing a memoir?
There are so many different types of memoir. I don't think you need to have a degree or a certificate. I have a degree, like a bachelor's in creative writing and an MFA in creative nonfiction, but that's just me because I like being in school. I mean, there are so many people who've never even gone to school who've written memoir. If you could string sentences together and make them coherent and make them true, that's the other thing. Truth is definitely an ingredient. We've all seen people get blasted in public for lying in their memoir. And it's okay to say, I don't know this, but this is what I think happened. It's okay. I mean, because we're all, humans who have failability, and we can make mistakes or not understand something. And it's okay to say in your memoir, I didn't get it, but this is what I thought happened. And I don't think you need, if you would feel better and more capable in getting a degree to write a memoir, do that. But you don't have to have one. You just got to tell a true and engaging story, and as a robust a story as you can. Yeah.
We have one hand raised I think online, and then we'll have to wrap it up, I'm afraid.
Hi. Can you hear me? I think I'm unmuted. Okay.
Is Marita there?
I'm here.
I can't. I think we may have to.
Okay. I'm unmuted.
Did she type it or?
No, I'm asking a question. It's okay.
She's unmuted.
Yeah, I'm unmuted.
Oh, Marita, was that you?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, speak, please.
Can you hear me? Maybe you already answered my question.
Here, well, in the meantime, let's.
It's okay. All right. It's okay.
I'm going to answer just because you use the word obstreperous. What? I love it.
And we just need.
When you said somebody got caught not telling the truth, or maybe not caught, because I always like stories that have unreliable narrators. And when is it creative writing, and when is it just bad dishonesty? Or this
Well,
is
if
not
you're
a legitimate question.
well, if you are putting out something that is a memoir, which has this, the burden of truth, memoir, autobiography, journalism, you have to tell the truth. Or make it a work of fiction. That's fine. But just tell us it's a work of fiction. Yeah. I mean, when I pick up a memoir, I'm assuming the writer is telling me the truth as best as they can recall it and not fooling around with me. Yeah. Because, I mean, there's certainly more of a market for fiction. So, if you're going to fictionalize your life, and many people have done that, just call it what it is. Yeah. You want to build trust in your readers, There was a question from, yeah. Yes. An unreliable narrator is fantastic in fiction. You know, Eudora Welty. Her fiction was full of unreliable narrators. They were crazy, some of them. And then there was Marita. Marita, did she go away? Is she online?
Rob?
Also, I want to say journaling helps. You know, if I was a big journaler during my youth, you know, from the age of 14 until who knows when, I was journaling pretty regularly. Is she not there? Okay, sorry. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
I love your title. How'd you come up with it?
My title comes from my grandmother, Ella Baskin. This is something she said to me often. What you don't know will make a whole new world. And it was an admonition, you know, when she felt I was getting a little too chippy, a little too big for my britches, too smart. And, you know, there's a scene in here where she says that, you know, during the moon landing, we were arguing back and forth about the moon landing and if it was real or not real. So anyway, thanks for asking that question. I was 10 or 11. Yeah, I think I was 10.
All right. Well, Dorothy, thank you so, so much.
Thank you all.